Hello everyone and welcome to my little corner of the internet. My name's Michael and I'm bitten by a radioactive book. Today we're concluding our guide to fantasy with the ninth and last part about dark fantasy. Now, dark fantasy is a term that is used to describe when fantasy or the fantastical elements are mostly horror elements and the whole story is set in a secondary world. This focus on secondary worlds mostly occurs due to the fact that horror, of course, is most often set in contemporary worlds, and contemporary fantasy and urban fantasy can both have paranormal or supernatural elements as well. So, when these elements occur in a secondary world and are its primary setting, then we refer to the book as dark fantasy. So dark fantasy is again one subgenre that is more based on the setting and on the atmosphere. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't some, loose rules regarding characters. So what you can expect from characters is pretty much what you can expect from characters in horror novels. We often have characters that have to face or overcome some sort of primal fear in their life, where the actual horror element of the book is just like a physical manifestation of that kind of fear, of that struggle that the character has. And these are often the stories that are told in dark fantasy as well. The other element, of course, in dark fantasy is that we often have like fantastical or horror creatures themselves, like demons, for characters. So we get a look into the mindset of characters that are mostly perceived as evil. So in contrast maybe to the supernatural elements we have in contemporary settings, the dark fantasy setting allows us to also get a bit into the mind of the creature or of the element that is causing the horror. That does not happen, of course, in every dark fantasy book, but there are dark fantasy books that have maybe one point of view from, like an evil person, an evil necromancer, a demon, or something like that, that we would normally not see maybe in a horror movie. And of course it has the term dark in it. There could be the question, so how does dark fantasy separate itself from grimdark fantasy? Now, as we said in grimdark fantasy, we mostly have characters that are motivated by their own reasons and that also struggle with some issues, but they're mostly normal characters without supernatural abilities, for example. So a grimdark fantasy is more like a bleak world where normal disillusioned characters do awful things to other normal characters that might become disillusioned by the awful things that are done to them. And in dark fantasy we more have like the violence might also be there, because in a horror kind of way, but the feeling of it is more in a supernatural sense. So there's always like a supernatural reason or supernatural characters involved. That is, so you could say if the setting is way more mundane and bleak, it's more of a grimdark fantasy, and if the setting is more like in the supernatural as well with many magical elements, we could say it's a dark fantasy. Now let's head into the recommendation section. One of the books that is often referred to as one of the first really dark fantasy books is Gormenghast by Mervyn Pike. It's from, I think, 1946, and the setting is the magical castle of Gormenghast, and the family members there are preparing for a birthday party, I think, and the villain tries to exploit the gaps in formal rituals of the time that the family has, and the issues that each of the family members has. And that tells you a bit of the psychological element of horror that story has, and this is also part of dark fantasy. Next up we have Black Sun Rising by C.S. Friedman, the first in the Coldfire trilogy. It's a kind of weird setting, because it's a setting where humans went to space and settled on this new planet, but then the technology they had was forgotten, and they went back to some kind of Victorian era, maybe. It has the feeling of a bit of a gothic element. I always describe it as, yeah, like a bit like the Bram Stoker atmosphere, but set on another planet, on another secondary world. And here again we have some characters that all have their own personal journey, and it's all about sacrifice, what each character has to sacrifice to achieve some things in the story, how far they are willing to let their humanity go. These are all elements of dark fantasy as well. So you can see that the human mind in itself is a huge factor there. Next up we have Daughter of the Blood by Anne Bishop, and there we have a dimension or a world that reminds us a lot of hell. The characters are often styled with like names that refer to Satan or Lucifer or other beings that we know from Christian mythology. And the main character there, or not the main character, but the main focus, is a young girl. She is born into this world, and she is has the prophecy of being a very, very powerful witch and a queen. And we have like 3 powerful men in this realm that all try to manipulate her and win influence over her, so she will in the end work for them or fight for them. This book is not for the faint of heart, because it has some very disturbing scenes in it. The realm is a realm of violence and of sexual abuse, but as the book is written by a woman, the sexual abuse is even by women towards men in some examples. So if you are not very comfortable with themes like this, that might be a book to steer away from. But for everyone else, this should be a very excellent read and a very good example for dark fantasy. Another book that plays with Christian mythology is Misery, an Autumn Tale by Teresa Frohock. This is a book where we have an exorcist called Lucian, and he left his lover in hell to rescue his sister. And his sister wants nothing of it. She doesn't want to be rescued because she wants his help to like open the gates of hell and lead the fallen into world, spelled with an E between the O and the R, which is a realm that is like a battleground between heaven and hell. This is all, sounding like very contemporary in terms of it uses as Christian terms, but it is all a secondary fantasy world. So these realms of world, hell, or heaven are secondary fantasy worlds, and so the images or the terminology is Christian, and of course therefore there is kind of a link toward it. We have a secondary fantasy world tale. And last but not least, we have Melusine by Sarah Monette, the first in the Doctrine of Labyrinths trilogy, I think, or let's say series to be sure. There we have like a wizard who was trained and abused to pass as a nobleman and be some kind of spy. And we also have a thief that grew up on the streets, and both are entwined in a tale of intrigue and also become lovers, I think, because this book is often mentioned as being part of the male romance spectrum as well. So for readers who look into a bit of diversity regarding their characters, that might be an interesting pick to go for. And as you can see, with the wizard being like trained and abused and forced to do all this spying, of course he again has some psychological issues to deal with, and as I said before, this is what we often see in horror and therefore in secondary world dark fantasy as well. So this concludes this part of the guide and the guide itself. I hope it was helpful overall to establish a few of the subgenres of fantasy, to see where they have their borders, where they have their themes, what kind of characters, what kind of stories and plots you can expect from the different subgenres. But in the end, let me say one word of advice how to take this guide overall. I often see a lot of discussion in forums, maybe even very heated discussions, where somebody says, oh, this is this kind of subgenre, and someone else comes and says, no, this is this subgenre because it has this element and that. And that is not the purpose of subgenres. It's not to fight against someone else and try to explain what a story is about and what not. It's more something for yourself, where you set the borders, and that helps you to understand what kind of stories you like and to what kind of stories you are drawn. And as you have seen in this guide, most of the genres, or some of the genres, often occur in like the same story or the same book, or can be applied to the same story. So we often find each other in a situation where we say, oh yeah, that is a low fantasy, which is set in an urban setting, so it's an urban fantasy, but the story in itself is like a sword and sorcery. So there are genres and settings that complement each other a lot. And as we have seen, some of the genres are more focused on the motivations of the characters. Some of the genres are more focused on the setting itself. Some terms like high and low fantasy only refer to the amount of magical elements or fantastical elements within the story. So there is often leeway, and you will find seldomly a story where you can say this is that subgenre and only that subgenre. So yeah, like take this guide more of a passive kind of knowledge for yourself that helps you to establish or to make better decisions about what you want to read, and maybe not take it offensively into the fight on some forum site to tell someone who just called a high fantasy, an epic fantasy set in a low fantasy world, a high fantasy, like, oh, you have no idea. That's not the purpose of this guide. So the last remaining question is, what will happen to Thursdays on my channel? There will be a science fiction subgenre guide coming up, but that will be at some point next year. I want to read a bit more science fiction before I do that, because I'm not anywhere near the amount of knowledge I have in fantasy regarding to science fiction. And what you can see in the immediate future on Thursdays will be a segment I call 15 in 2015. So starting next week, I'm going to present you 15 books each Thursday that might be on my to-be-read list in 2015. And we're doing this by genre, so next week you can expect 15 fantasy books, you can also expect 15 SF books and 15 steampunk books. Another part will be about 15 series I started in the past and want to finish maybe next year, or at least continue with them next year. So at the end of the year we have a bit of an overview and outlook into what might be in the cards for me and this channel next year regarding content that I'm going to read. Last but not least, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who commented on the guide videos, who watched the guide videos, who enjoyed them, liked them, and encouraged me to be on the right path with them, that it's really helpful for people to get a bit more into, or who want to get a bit more and deeper into the whole fantasy genre. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to go on this journey with you, and I hope to see you soon in another kind of guide video for science fiction next year. And up until then, I hope you're going to have fun with the 15 in 2015 segment. So that's it for this guide. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of me, subscribe to my channel. If you want to know what's coming up on my channel, look inside the description box. There's a little segment there called On the Horizon. I wish you a good day and hope you get bitten by a really good book too. Bye.